Well, despite hopes of a breakthrough, it seems the Gulf crisis that's seen Qatar living under a blockade for nearly 5 months is going to continue. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is in the region, but says the Saudi Arabian-led bloc isn't ready to negotiate. After meeting Qatar's Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani in Doha, he called on all sides to de-escalate the tension, but said the U.S. couldn't force any discussions. Tillerson flew from Saudi Arabia, where he'd met King Salman, but there was no indication of any progress there. He also held talks with Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi and says he wants to counter Iranian influence in Iraq. Patty Culhane reports from Doha.
He talked tough on his way over, blaming the Saudi-led coalition for the impasse. But in the region, the tough talk stopped.
Meetings with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman asked him to please engage in dialogue. There's not a strong indication that parties are ready to talk yet. And so we cannot force talks upon people who are not ready to talk.
Still, U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson took great pains to compliment the Qataris.
Significant progress has been made in a number of important efforts in our counterterrorism joint efforts, including sharing of terrorist lists, terrorist financing. We've participated in a number of counterterrorism technical sessions and training, and significant steps have been taken to enhance aviation security.
He didn't criticize the blockading countries, not even after the Saudis seemed to publicly slight him by sending the deputy minister of protocol to the airport. For his part, the Qatari foreign minister is clearly frustrated by the behavior of the 4 blockading countries.
I also feel sorry to say that they are not ready to face this issue and to tackle with dialogue the reasons for this crisis. These countries have resorted to undiplomatic methods that have nothing to do with modern diplomatic channels, and this is no good.
Secretary Tillerson isn't leaving the region, and he is expected to do one more press conference, this time on his own here in Doha. So that means he has one more chance, however unlikely, to try and put some public pressure on the blockading countries to try to resolve this crisis as it begins to enter its 5th month. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Doha.
Osama Shahata is an associate professor of Middle Eastern politics at the University of Oklahoma. He's joining us from Oklahoma. Thank you very much for your time. Rex Tillerson was also, when he was in Saudi Arabia, attending the inauguration of a new joint body established by Iraq and Saudi Arabia, in part to fight against ISIL. Is it unrealistic for us to assume that, given that that might have been his focus, that the Gulf crisis itself may have been of as significant importance?
No, I think that's completely correct. His meeting with Haider al-Abadi as well as King Salman, it's a tripartite commission, as it were. The Saudis, the Americans, and the Iraqis certainly was probably the most important part of this trip, not only in terms of combating ISIS, but also to try to wean Iraq away or outside of the Iranian orbit as much as possible. There's no question that that was, I think, of paramount importance. At the same time, however, one of the reasons Mr. Tillerson didn't make any progress is because he knew, and he indicated this in a Bloomberg interview even before he left, that the Saudis and Emiratis weren't really interested in making any progress or really negotiating at this stage. So he had low expectations from the very beginning.
Given the fact that there seems to be little movement on either side as far as the blockade itself is concerned, there seems to be a consensus that it needs an outside mediator to move things forward. The logical position should be that held by the U.S., but it sounds as though the U.S. can't do very much about this either.
Well, you're completely correct. The U.S. actually could do a tremendous amount, and this is, I think, really what needs analysis. Of course, the United States has a very important relationship with all of the parties involved: Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Qatar, Egypt, and Bahrain, having military bases in 2 or 3 of those countries that I've listed. But it seems as if the Trump administration is unwilling to exert significant pressure on Saudi Arabia and on the Emirates to resolve the crisis. So I think that really is what's going on here. Mr. Tillerson, I think we've known his perspective from quite some time. He's been, I think, sympathetic to the Qatari position, but it's also been known, especially at the very beginning when Mr. Trump was irresponsibly making tweets about Qatar and terrorism and so on, that Trump has been less sympathetic to the Qatari position and, shall we say, maybe more beholden to Saudi whisperings.
So if I understand what you're saying correctly, that basically whatever efforts Rex Tillerson might be tempted to make in trying to find some sort of mediation in this dispute, the Saudis are going to automatically bypass him in their own minds and go straight to the President of the United States, because that's where they see getting their support.
I think that's correct. And I think if you've been in the United States for the last week, there have been real questions, not just about Mr. Tillerson's efficacy with regard to Qatar, but Mr. Tillerson's standing in the White House. There have been reports that Mr. Tillerson was going to resign. There have been reports that Mr. Tillerson called Mr. Trump a word that I can't repeat on television, and so on. So Mr. Tillerson's standing in general has been called into question. And of course, there are many issues dealing with American foreign policy right now that actually are seen to be more important than the Qatar GCC crisis, North Korea, for example, and other issues having to do with terrorism. So yes, Mr. Tillerson's standing in general has been one that has been called into question.
Always good to get your views on this. Thank you very much indeed, Samar Shahata.